Hello, everybody, and welcome to the TSM University Q&A series. I'm your host for today, Ashkan, Collegiate Shoutcaster, and today we're joined by the wonderful Matt Fisher. Matt, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing fantastic. Excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Glad to have you on today. Matt, can you give us a quick introduction into what it is that you do and how you feel about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So my title is Director of Performance for Atomos Esports. We're a company that's based out of Vancouver, BC, Canada, but have clients around the world. In that role, I also serve as a performance coach, which in the world of esports can mean many different things. My background does come primarily from the traditional sport world, working as a strength and conditioning coach, sort of transition my way into mental performance. And then I sort of, a little bit of a tangent, a little bit of a breakaway there. I actually did complete a master's in mental health counseling. So did a recently
Oh.
completed an internship doing, counseling with a lot of different folks for all sorts of different things that amazingly enough has really helped prepare me for a lot of the things that I've seen in esports. So, I've been in the esports world for a couple of years now, but still learning the ropes and excited again to hopefully share some of my experiences here.
Awesome. We're definitely going to be glad to hear about him. It sounds like so you've got a good balance of both mind and body. And then
Mhm.
because of that, even though esports is a little bit of a, I guess you could call it a newer field, you're still more than armed and ready for it, is what it sounds like.
Absolutely. No, I think that as much as the traditional sport world does have, a lot of differences, of course, compared to esports, there's so many learnings that I think hopefully I can bring into this space, making sure obviously to make adjustments for the specific needs of esports. But I think there's a lot that can be transitioned and really hopefully help move things in the right direction in this environment.
Awesome. So we actually do have already a good few questions lined up for you, but before we get into them, I just want to tell the audience, ladies and gentlemen, if you want your question answered today, make sure you head over to the TSMU Discord at discord.gg/TSMU and go into the Q&A questions channel. If you submit them, we'll eventually get to them. But for now, we're going to go ahead and lead into the very first question, Matt, by Galaxy, who has asked, how much is physical and mental health connected?
Great question, Galaxy. I think that it is impossible to separate the two, and I think more and more we are really beginning to just get a grasp of how interconnected they are. And I'm going to really say in both ways. So, looking at, I'd say in the esports world, oftentimes we may not even recognize how let's say some physical, let's just say discomfort, spending a lot of time seated. How is, a little nagging pain in our lower back really going to affect our emotional tolerance, our emotional regulation? We may not even recognize how our physical health is really affecting our emotions, our thoughts. Obviously, we know that on the physical side of things, if we can't do our jobs, if we are having physical issues, if we're having pain with our wrists, whatever it might be, that's going to stress us out. We're going to be worried about whether or not we can perform. So many interconnections there. And then on the opposite side of things, the mental health, really, I think it affects our physical self. Again, way more than most of us are aware of. So I'm going to sort of throw out one of my favorite books here. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly there, but bit of a heavy read, but it's one of these books that's been really groundbreaking, really in the psychology world, and it just talks about one of the biggest, I think, challenges we have with mental health is oftentimes our easiest coping mechanism is just avoidance. We have stresses, we have anxieties, and we're just like, okay, I just don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it. And more we're starting to see evidence of how these avoidance practices, how these stresses, all of these mental, emotional stressors are really starting to manifest themselves physically. And so, there's all sorts of theories out there of, how many of these unexplainable cancers might be coming from emotional distress. More obvious things like PTSD and just anxiety as a whole, how it creates tension in us. So absolutely, I think those two are completely connected, and I think we're only starting to really scratch the surface of just how much they really are. Not even looking at, nutrition and all these other pieces, sleep, all of those things are just so interconnected. So, yeah, you can't separate the two.
It sounds like a very fine balance, and no matter what, it's all in the middle of a delicate system. I actually want to draw
Hmm.
this back a little bit closer to gamers and the esports community as a whole and to what could be applicable to them. Would you say, comparatively, since you said you have your sports background, when it comes to a quote unquote imbalance or issues between physical and mental health, would you say that gamers struggle in one category more so than the other? Or do you find anything particular to gamers that you feel could be worked on as a maybe an overarching skill or habit?
I think that's a great question. And I think, the stereotype is going to say, oh, obviously gamers are going to be really having a deficit on the physical side of things. I would say that I think really when it comes down to it, and this to me is just a whole part of the mental performance game, not just performance, but wellness side of things is self-awareness. And this can be physical self-awareness. This can actually be understanding just where we hold our tension, where we hold our anxiety, where we experience stress, some of those little cues, but then also being aware of what are the actual things that are stressing us out. So I think when it comes to gamers in particular, of course, most of us, I mean, even in a traditional sport world, there's always things where we could be doing more on the physical side. Maybe that's we spend too much time, getting big and strong, but not enough time working on flexibility or balance or those types of things. Obviously, when it comes to esports competition, there's going to be a great deal of cognitive stress there as well. And so I think really, with both sides of them, just where the base question came from, how much are they interconnected? Yeah, I think overall with gamers, it's on both sides of the spectrum. And I think it's really a matter of just deciding, yeah, where do I want to begin? Because probably every single one of us, gamer or not, has some room for improvement.
Of course, nobody's perfect, and we are all of our journeys have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Uh, with that, I want to actually transition to the second question from JJ, who asks, "How was your transition from traditional sports to gaming?"
Yeah, I think that for me, to be honest, it was probably a lot easier than a lot of people I've seen, including my own colleagues who are trying to make the same transition. A little bit more, I guess, about my background is most of my time was spent working with the Canadian national freestyle snowboard team, and so I think that type of athlete really prepared me for some of the challenges that I've seen in the esports world going back in time, back in 2010, this is where the Olympics were held in Vancouver. It was announced that freestyle snowboarding was going to be in the next Olympics, 2014 in Sochi. And so at that time, you had a bunch of like unbelievable, I'm going to call them riders because they didn't want to be called athletes at that time, a bunch of riders who were, winning X Games gold medals, all those sorts of things. But they had all gotten to that level without going to the gym, without thinking about nutrition, without working with, a mental performance consultant. They just did what they did, having fun, learning as a kid through their teen years, working their way up, and they just reached their peak. And so trying to get them to buy into some of these things that they had never done before and never really needed before to achieve excellence was quite a challenge for me at the time, because coming from more traditional sports where, again, these are the types of things that you were introduced to from a very young age, it was really interesting for me. And so many of my learnings of just understanding, hey, listen, we're not going to force a culture change on these athletes. We're not going to come in and just say, have to do this, too many must do's is only going to push them further away from really trying to buy into that. Because oftentimes the reason they got into freestyle snowboarding was to have that freedom, was to get away from sort of the traditional, jock sports that maybe they've had, as many of us have, poor experiences with, whether it was in high school or whatever. So understanding the patience needed, and really trying to figure out ways to organically grow the buy-in in esports. I think I learned from my experiences working with these, I guess, sort of non-traditional traditional sport athletes. And so very grateful to them for all of the learnings they taught me, because I'm sure some of them will tell some stories of me coming in a little too hot of, I know what's best for you versus, okay, how can I learn from you and then help support you with wherever you want to go. So knowing, especially I'd say even in the last year, how many of my colleagues have become interested in the esports space, and as soon as they sort of dip their toes in the waters, they just sort of like, okay, what am I getting myself into? I think for a lot of them, if they do decide to pursue it, it's going to be a lot more difficult than it was for me, and some of them might just decide it's not the right place, which again, to each their own. So yeah, good question. For me, hasn't been easy, still so many learnings. I still have a lot to learn within this space, including like making sure I'm doing everything on Discord correctly. But no, it's been a fun transition thus far.
Okay, that's awesome to hear. Would you say that there's one specific skill, or let me rephrase this question. If you had to look at yourself and you had the opportunity to speak to yourself when you were just stepping into esports, what is something that you would tell yourself that would probably be a key factor in significantly improving the process, before having to go through all this development?
So I'm going to steal a term from a great mentor that we've had an opportunity to work with. He's a mental performance coach, works with New Zealand rugby. He's just a brilliant guy, and so um, I would say understanding that what the average esport athlete needs is they need a tradesman or a tradesperson versus a philosopher. So I feel like much of how I approached what I was doing when I first got into this space was too much. It was I mean, ironic that we're on TSMU right now, but it was too much of like a university lecture style of really, here's the science behind why you should be doing X, Y, and Z that I'm offering. When realistically, all of these athletes just wanted, a practical tool to help them do what they already know how to do, but just do it a little bit better. So if I were to go back, and this is where I think I have the opportunity as our team at Atomos has grown, is using my experience to say, hey, listen, what are the practical things that we can help them start to see value in right away? Because we are trying to sell them on something that they just, again, probably have never needed before. And so maybe some of them do, and I should say a lot of them do actually appreciate a better understanding of, why should I do this, not just what should I be doing. But I think too much I really erred on that side of like, yeah, this nobody wants to be sitting in a university lecture when they're coming in to just learn how to play the game better.
Interesting. So it sounds like when you initially want to go break down that wall, definitely that logic based view is going to be important at some point down the line. But when you initially go to approach a player, you need to develop that kind of bond relationship and understanding first about their needs, and maybe even a little bit of listening more so than saying. Would that be correct?
You just I don't think I could word that better than you did there, Ashcon. No, I think that's just it, is rapport and buy-in, especially starting off in the COVID world. You don't have that ability to just be there in that room with people. And so trying to establish that trust, that rapport. Some of the things that we are looking to support athletes in are things that are uncomfortable to talk about. And I think that yeah, really focusing on just making that I'm going to say human to human connection, not a performance coach to esport athlete connection. Just that human to human connection is so important to begin with, because only then, once they understand, well, hey, you know what, you're actually, hopefully a good person. They think I am, but you're somebody who's actually here to help me. You're not looking to get something from me, which I hate to say. I've seen too much of, especially in the traditional sport world. Whether it's agents, coaches, other teammates. It's sort of like too much of, okay, how can this person help me achieve my goals? And so I think, to your point, really connecting and letting them know that, yeah, I'm here for you, and your success is in turn going to be success for me. But yeah, rather than just coming in hot, just being like, do this, here's why you should do this. Yeah, here's a reason that we can connect on, that then hopefully will allow us to make that transition a little bit easier.
Okay, understood. Well, with closing out that point, I think we want to move on to the next question offered up by KO, who has asked, how widely practiced do you anticipate mental awareness and coaching to be in a couple of years from now within the esports scene?
Mm. Great question. I'm going to give sort of maybe a bit of a two-part answer here. So I think it's going to be one of those ones where it is already, I've seen how much more uptake there is when it comes to these things. I think this also is tied a little bit just to the destigmatization of mental awareness, mental health as a whole. You know, knowing that this is the type of thing that often wasn't openly talked about. Even 5 years ago, it was a huge difference, let alone, you know, going back with my age, 15, 20 years ago. So I think that people are way more open to it. The number of conversations I have with esports athletes where right away they are like, yeah, here's the things that I'm dealing with in game, here are the things I'm dealing with out of the game. Their willingness and their actual awareness to understand that these are things they should be addressing is night and day where it was a year ago, a couple years back. I think the lag that we're going to see, though, and I've seen this in other traditional sports as well, is not because they are fearing the stigma of it. I think there's going to be a lot of top level athletes who have really developed their mental skills, who continue to train their mental skills, who continue to up level themselves, but are going to keep it a secret because that is their performance advantage. You know, I saw the same thing going back to snowboard where when there wasn't this buy-in, a lot of the rookies were like, well, you know, these top snowboarders, like they don't go to the gym. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I see them at the gym every day, but they want you to think they're not going to the gym because that's how they're going to stay one step ahead of you. So I think right now mental performance training, mental skills training is far more prevalent within the esports world than we might be aware of, because I think that some people are just like, hey, you know what, the longer I can keep this a secret, the better off I'm going to be compared to my competition. But that secret is not going to be kept long. I do think a couple years from now, if you are, just as I've seen, same thing in the traditional sport world, where strength and conditioning, you know, you sort of started it in your late teen years and, you know, you really only fully got into it when you reach that sort of professional level. Then it transitioned to you're starting to do this, you know, at 12 years old, you're starting to learn how to move properly in a weight room. I think the difference that you're going to start to see is in a couple years time, you're going to have those, I'm going to say kids, you know, 10, 11, 12, 13, whatever year, you know, age they are going to start to be working on some of these mental skills. And what I love about it is the mental skills that we need for esports competition are ones that are going to prepare you for every aspect of life. So to me, whether or not you use them to become a, you know, collegiate or professional esports athlete or not, those are skills that are not going to be lost. They are going to help you in whatever direction you decide to go in life.
I have two branches there from your answer.
All right.
My first branch is I'm going to say that, or I'm going to ask, do you feel, since you mentioned it yourself, that it kind of ties together or is relative to every aspect of life? Do you feel that top athletes from or top performers of any field have to learn those mental skills? In other words, obviously, when you hit the highest level of any competition, the physical side is going to be more equal, and really what it comes down to is mental. Would you say that that's the case? Would you say that it's all a mental battle at the highest level of competition?
Absolutely. You know, it's funny, Ashka. That's actually, that realization is what convinced me to transition from the physical training side of things to the mental training side of things. So when I was very lucky, very fortunate to support the national snowboard team at two Olympics in 2014 and 2018 in Pyeongchang, and it was in 2018 when I realized that, you know what, like our athletes, well, pretty much across the field, you know, all the countries had caught up to. We were a little bit ahead when it came to the physical side of performance for snowboarders in 2014, I'd say, than a lot of the other countries. But by the time 2018 came around, everybody had caught up. You know, everybody, that secret was out. Everybody was in the weight room just as much as our Canadian athletes were. And where I saw the difference was absolutely, just as you said, it was on the mental side of things. And so that sort of told me, you know what, like there's still some catching up to do. I'm surrounded by the best athletes in the world. And so many of them have absolutely perfected, just as you said, their physical preparation to the point that the differences are not huge. You know, they're marginal across that elite level, but the gaps between the mental preparation it was astounding to me at that level. Some of those athletes, absolutely. They had been spending years working on that. Some had never even thought about it. They had just been able to rely on that, those physical genetic gifts that they've been given, as well as, obviously the skill based training they'd been doing for years. But I don't think a lot of them really anticipated just how different a beast the Olympics are. As big as the X Games is, it's small potatoes when it comes to the Olympics. And so
The creme
those
de la
who
creme.
Yeah, exactly. So, you have just an international, all these eyes that have never paid attention to your sport before from around the world, you now have, that spotlight on you. And so I think those who are not mentally prepared, it was amazing slash disheartening to see just how many of them really did struggle when it came to performing at that top level. And again, these are things that they've been preparing for their entire lives, physically, technically, tactically. But I don't think a lot of them realized until it was too late that they might have had a little bit of a deficit when it came to that mental side of things. And just as you said, yeah, those who had put in the work, those who understood that, those are the ones that came away achieving their goals.
They had that cutting edge. Now,
Absolutely.
to that second branch there, you had mentioned a sort of secretivism when it came to having the competitive advantage. And for the short term, that'll work for an individual. But do you have any opinions or thoughts on how that affects a competition as a whole? For example, Valorant is a relatively new esport, but we see teams constantly kind of hiding their new strategies and they're very secretive about what they do. Do you think that's secretivism, whether it be mental, physical, technical, has an effect on the sport itself as a whole, the
Mm.
growth with everyone?
That's a really interesting question, and knowing, for example, where Valorant's potentially going, in 2023 with sort of that league model, one of the biggest disparities, as I think we know, is just in resources. So a lot of the organizations like a TSM, they have the ability to provide these resources to their athletes. I think where it's going to where it's going to make a bit less of a difference across an entire, let's say esport entire game, is there's still so much low hanging fruit. So even though you do have some of these organizations who are providing mental performance training, physical training, whether it's private chefs, all these other things, it's still amazing that those aren't necessarily the teams that are always performing at the top level. I think that the interesting thing to me is, seeing that next generation, and when we talk next generation, they might just be a couple years younger than the current generation who are playing professionally, but they're the ones who are often already doing some of the things that I think the pros are not currently doing. So I'm sure there's a ton of Valorant players out there who are just grinding away doing their thing, but are already thinking about, well, what is it going to take for me to get that opportunity at that next level? And so I think the secrets that are out there are not so secret that it's holding back esports or a specific genre as a whole. I think you're always going to have those people who are going to look for other ways to achieve their goals, and that is going to be different than how the generation before them might have achieved that. So, you know what? I do think that the grind is going to start to dissipate. I think there's going to be more time spent to physical and mental preparation. And I think that is, as much as some teams think that's a secret, I don't think that, we should be surprised if there's a lot of people out there who are already doing a lot of these things. And next thing you know, they're going to just come onto the scene and be like, wow, this is your first year playing pro Valorant, and already you were doing all these things that only we thought the pro teams were doing. How did you figure this out? And yeah, you know what? When you were trying to reach that next level, you're the one who is really looking for every single advantage you can find. So yeah, as much as I say these things are secretive, I don't think it's enough to be holding back, the scene as a whole.
That's really reinvigorating, really exciting because obviously it's such a new esport, and to know that it already has very strong prospects means it's going to be a really entertaining couple of years at the very least.
Absolutely.
So moving forward to KO asking another question. Have you empathized on different talking points or reshaped your curriculum for mental coaching in esports compared to your previous experience with traditional sports? And if so, would you mind
Mm.
elaborating?
Another great question. Really, really great question. So, one of the things I would say that I've spent a lot more of my time working on within the esports world than the traditional sport world when it comes to mental coaching is working on, I would say, the interpersonal dynamics. So how many of the challenges, it's the same as traditional sport. There's going to be performance anxiety, there's going to be issues with focus, all of these things that just come from performing under pressure. But how many of the conversations I have with athletes are based on oftentimes the environment that they're in. So, not to throw esports as a whole under the bus, but oftentimes we'll have, coaches were former players a year ago and they have no formal coaching experience. So, how do they help to address, interpersonal conflict within teams? How do we build trust and culture within teams is something that we've started to recognize. As much as I'll have a team say, hey, listen, this athlete is just not performing well. You need to work on them on their focus or something. And it's like, well, realistically, the focus in game is not a problem. It's that they're having challenges outside of the game. And so much of what I find working on within the esports world compared to the traditional sport world is really how do we help to create an environment that is going to facilitate performance? You look at traditional sports, I'm going to throw out there like a Manchester United. I mean, they've got 100 plus years of team culture, you know, maybe it's a bad example right now with how they're doing for any football fans out there, but they've got a lot of these systems in place so that when this talent comes in, all they have to do is just do their thing and perform. Whereas a lot of these esports organizations, we just simply don't have enough time to have developed a true history of excellence. And so really spending time trying to up level the organization, the coaches, the team as a whole, because so many times I really feel like that's what's impacting not just one individual athlete, but the entire team. And so I'll often say this, how many times do I, this isn't what I went to school for, but it'll be like, you know what, we've got an athlete coming in from overseas. How are we welcoming them to a brand new culture? Are we, do they even know how to get around with transportation? Can we help them find some, some foods that might be comfortable to them? Because those are the types of things that can be distracting them far more than actually playing the game itself. So much of the time I spend now with esports athletes, believe it or not, is really working on out of game things versus specifically the in-game things that I think is more of a symptom of the actual issues they're facing. So that being said as well, I think one of the other things about esports compared to traditional sports is, obviously you've got traditional sport athletes who have Twitter followings, Instagram, whatever. But how much I think I see social media really impact esports athletes to the point where I've had athletes who are literally, reading a Reddit thread between maps and seeing what the community is saying about the way they're playing, and they're allowing that to potentially adjust their play style. That's not something that you would see in traditional sports. You're not going to see Steph Curry looking at his Twitter feed at halftime and being like, oh, okay, I better shoot more, I better pass more. So how much of the community can really influence how esports athletes are performing, I think is something that also was quite different compared to what I was used to in the traditional sport world.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been plenty of cases where we've seen professional players immediately hop off their game and hop into a co-streamer in another room, get on their stream, or immediately they're on Twitter or they're in Twitter between the matches, absolutely themselves. And that's been in. I think you're right. I haven't noticed it comparing it to traditional sports until now that you mention it, and that is very interesting observation. 100%. I want to move on to one more question before I actually want to get a little bit more personal with your journey. How does a player's gamer identity affect their personal lives?
This is again, and actually tying into the previous question there from KO is oftentimes when I have conversations for the first time with an athlete, I'll literally say, here's your gamer tag, here's your name, what do you normally go by? And it's interesting to see what their answer is. And I will generally, unless they've got a real preference or their gamer tag happens to be, their actual name, I often try and really focus on, if your name is Mike, I'm going to call you Mike. Because I think so much of who we are oftentimes can get attached to a specific identity. And if your job is a professional esports athlete, a professional gamer, it can be really tough to separate yourself when you're outside of the game. So if all of your happiness, if all of your self-worth comes from how you're performing when you've got that gamer identity on, it can cause a lot of problems outside of the game, and it can add a lot of pressure that can actually affect your performance. And so how many times I'll actually get my athletes to write out, it's like, what other identities do you have beyond just your gamer identity? Are you a brother? Are you a friend? Are you a student? Are you a mentor? Are you a coach? Are you a son? Are you a daughter? Once we start to recognize that we have many different identities, and even though maybe the identity I'm best known for is my gamer identity, maybe that should just be part of who I am. And if I can find ways that I can attach, my values from other identities across the spectrum of who I consider I am, then I can really handle a lot of the pressures that come when I put that gamer identity on, because I don't want to pretend to know what it's like to have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of followers who know who I am and who are going to critique every little thing I do, whether it's on stream, whether it's in competition, and how to separate yourself from, from the critiques that you get. We know that it can be a toxic place. And oftentimes I think when we have that gamer identity, that hat that we're wearing, we feel like we owe something to to our fans, to those people out there in the Twitterverse or whatever. And that can just absolutely drain us. It can absolutely drain us. And I think one of the other things I'll say is, we know, unfortunately, currently in the esports world, like, an esports career of more than a couple of years is long, so we have very long lives to live, hopefully all of us, when we decide to take that gamer identity and retire it. And sometimes that's going to be our choice. Oftentimes it's not going to be our choice. We just may no longer have what it takes or have the opportunity to continue to do what we love on a professional level. And we need to be able to have something beyond our gamer identity to fall back on. And so I think that, just from a mental wellness standpoint, really figuring out, who do I really want to be? And am I too attached to that one identity that I take on when I'm playing games? I think is an important conversation to have for all of us. And I think it's an important self-awareness piece to really work on.
Hyperfixation on one identity resulting in basically negative outcome in all aspects of life, initially starting where the identity is, and then it compounds further, is what I'm hearing. Would you say that this ties into a lot of the workaholism, or what is it? I'm the term is escaping me now, but when you feel undeserving of everything around you, imposter syndrome. These two are heavily tied to esports. It feels like, even if it's not players, content creators as well constantly discuss these two topics. Do you think that sort of hyperfixation on identity is also the cause of those two topics as well?
They're absolutely connected, and I think, to me, it's interesting what you sort of said there of even if we know potentially something that is expected of us when we've got our gamer identity on isn't actually necessarily the best for us from a physical well-being standpoint, from a mental well-being standpoint, from a performance standpoint. There often are these expectations that are put on us that we have to do these things in order to fit into the community. So, I think there are probably a lot of players out there who are like, what? I don't actually think grinding solo queue for 5 hours after team scrims is really making me that much better a player, but I want to avoid the scrutiny of the community or other teammates thinking I'm not doing everything I can to be the best. And I think that, there's these expectations that are put on this gamer identity that just aren't realistic. They aren't actually beneficial, but just because it is the way that it is, it's the way that it always has been. Doesn't mean that there's a better way to do things. And I do think, again, coming back to that being sort of secretive, I think you're going to see a lot more players as they gain more experience realize, like, I can train smarter, not harder. I can do things that aren't going to really affect my self-worth or make me overly concerned about, am I imposter? Do I deserve to be here? I think they're going to start to recognize that, like, that self-doubt is really tied to me being completely tied up to this one identity. And when I have the security of knowing, like, hey, if that was to disappear tomorrow, if I was never, going to be able to play professionally again, I'm okay with that. And the moment that we can accept it, it's like, yeah, here's all my other identities that I can fall back on that are really giving me self-worth, then a lot of those self-doubts start to just disappear anyways.
And it sounds like it can also tie in, and correct me if I'm wrong, to also the idea that it's not practice making perfect, it's perfect practice makes perfect. That when you're living under that pressure of, oh, I have to play a little bit more, but you're playing mentally stressed, you're playing while tired, you're playing in an environment that is nowhere near the same environment. Of course, solo queue and the competitive matches aren't the same. That you could theoretically be worsening the quality of your practice or going into the negative direction. Do you think that could be the case as well?
I think you're spot on. Like, I think it's one of these things that we do need more evidence. We do need more research to be done, but already there's enough out there that kind of, I mean, and I'm going to say this, hopefully I don't insult anybody. There's a little bit of common sense that comes along with, like, yeah, if I'm exhausted, would some extra sleep help prepare me for competition tomorrow? It's that idea of, like, okay, if I'm going to try and cram for my exam till like 3 a.m. tonight, and then wake up for my 8 a.m. exam, like, how much of that is really going to be retained? And am I actually potentially going to, lose some of the information I had already stored because I'm going to be so tired for my exam tomorrow? So I do think that inadvertently we are shooting ourselves in the foot quite often. But again, we oftentimes are more worried about how are our teammates going to look at us? How is the community going to look at us if for some reason we're not doing what is expected of us, even if there's no real evidence to say that this is the best way to do things. And I think that using that, like, perfect practice, so much time is spent just scrimming. When you look at traditional sports, it's like, okay, today we are going to be working, I'll use basketball, we're going to be working on our set plays, we're going to be working on our 3-point shot. It's not like we just scrim, and it's not like the Lakers are scrimming against the Clippers every single 5 days a week before they go and play them on the weekend. It's just a very, very different mentality. And so I think that as we start to progress within esports, we're going to start to learn how to be more deliberate with what we are doing to prepare for competition. And I think along with that being more deliberate, we are going to get more perfect practice, and that quantity is going to start to come down to a healthier, more manageable level. And we will start to see, wow, performance is just going to increase across the board. I will say this, we know that oftentimes we look at the highest performing regions and we look at how they do things. One thing that I'm going to throw Canadian sports under the bus for is, we were known as the hockey nation, and the number of, I would say, ice hockey players who, there's this thing in traditional sports where you want to avoid what we call early specialization. If you want to become a professional hockey player at 18 years old, well, you should be playing other sports growing up so that by the time you get that opportunity, you're not so sick of hockey and you've developed all these complementary skills that you have a better chance of making it. But in Canada, what do I see all the time is we are still, okay, hockey.
It's all about hockey, eh?
It's all about hockey. And then we end up burning out a lot of these, these top prospects. But because we have such a deep pool of talent, because so many people in Canada do want to play hockey, well, we can burn out, the next Connor McDavid because there's another one waiting in line. And I think one of the things we don't realize, especially in North American esports, is, there are countries like China and South Korea who have so many League of Legends players. We don't necessarily hear the stories of those ones who have burnt out because all of a sudden they're gone, and the next, just as good player is waiting in line. We can't do those same things, I think, when we don't have that same talent pool. So what is possible and what helps facilitate, the level of performance we see in certain countries and certain games, we can't just assume that that's going to be effective across the world.
Understood. So you've given a lot of depth in terms of the answers. Obviously, the experience is bountiful, and clearly the work you're doing is amazing. And I want to kind of draw us back a little bit to what could be related to the audience. Of course, TSM University is representing those who are a little bit younger, probably between 16 to 24. So I want to ask you, when you were younger, what was it that you were up to? What kind of led you to this path? And what do you think could be done to have optimized someone of that age to get to where you are right now?
Oh, that's a good one. So, I'm gonna date myself a little bit here. So, I grew up in the I'll say this: the first game that I played or gaming system was ColecoVision back in the early '80s. So I don't know if anybody's even heard of that, but it was interesting. I've kind of come full circle in my I guess career to get back into, well, not get back to, but get to gaming. Grew up playing video games with my friends, but by the time I sort of got to university, everybody else had stopped playing, and I was the only one who was still playing at all. I think for me, really, I guess the path that I took here was a very, I mean, I would say this: in esports, when I look at my colleagues who are performance coaches who are doing the things that they're doing, everybody has a different story. And I think that's one of the things I love about the opportunity that esports presents, is it doesn't, there's not one right way to get here, and there's not one skill set, there's not one degree or specific talent that is required to be able to create a career within the esports space. When I look at our team at Atomos, we come from the physical side of things, we come from the mental side of things, we come from the mental health side of things. For me, I didn't really expect to be in esports. Even I go back to when I started to sort of transition more towards the mental performance side of things. Like, I expected to be working in traditional sports for the rest of my life. It was just the excitement that esports, I think, sort of offered. I think looking at what a lot of the people who I get questions from, who connect with me on LinkedIn, I think a lot of them, I realize, are coming from so many different places. And I think more and more there are some more directed channels that can help take you to where you want to be. But it's no different, I think, than a lot of other career paths. I do think that for so many people, just getting experience in working with other human beings, just understanding where your strengths and weaknesses are, working on yourself, and deciding, like, I might have to try on a bunch of different hats before I find one that really fits for me. And I think a lot of people who are going to try and get into esports are going to realize, like, maybe this isn't actually what I thought it was going to be. And I think that's okay. I'm going on a tangent here. I don't even know I'm answering your question, but I'm just going to keep rambling for a minute one way or another, because I like to hear myself talk. But
the mic's all yours.
The other thing I would say is for me, I did my undergrad in psychology, and I completed that, almost 20 years ago now, and did technically nothing with that degree. Ended up moving into the physical side of things and did a master's in exercise science, and that served me very well. And then when I ended up switching back and doing a master's of mental health counseling, I actually was like, you know what? I'm going to become a counselor, and this was during COVID. Like, where is the need? Where can I have the greatest, I think, help to hopefully society? But what I then realized is, okay, you know what? A lot of the experience that I had from the traditional sport world, we know there's a lot of mental health challenges within the esports world. And so I sort of, was lucky enough to find an opportunity where I could take my different experiences, my different educations, all of these things that may have seemed like they were going to go in different paths. And it just so happens within esports, they've kind of come full circle. And luckily enough for me, I think have given me enough experience and education to hopefully help take esports in a healthier direction, because really that's what my passion is. I think that's what all of us at Atomos and I think a lot of our competitors out there in the performance space, we're all here to just try and make the entire esports world a better place for everybody, regardless of the level you're playing.
And that's an awesome goal. Absolutely. Esports has definitely needed a little bit more openness. It's had that recently movement towards a lot of inclusion as well as mental health kind of being
Yeah.
promoted. And it's an awesome movement to see, to be certain. I want to kind of ask you as well, because a lot of these students here, they spend a lot of time playing the game. Maybe they fall into the toxic cycle of ranked, for example. You've probably heard the story thousands of times before. The League of Legends player who queues up solo queue, or the Valorant player who does the same, and they allow their mental to kind of spiral. And a lot of these players are also players who want to move into esports, whether it be as a player or in a support role. How important would you say is learning these games as opposed to learning those specific skills? And as you said, getting into those team-based environments and figuring out your own communication competence.
Another amazing question. I think that's just one of the keys. Is as much as I, have paid attention to esports and gaming a lot more than I'd say people my age, my friend group. I was still a complete noob, amateur coming into the esports world, really. And obviously, I've up leveled myself a lot when it comes to my understanding of a lot of these games. But I think, especially in my role as a performance coach, it's not like I'm only working with one genre. I'm not just working with League of Legends. So, an expectation to understand that I know the technical, tactical of Call of Duty, of Overwatch, of all these things is just it's impossible. And I think it would be kind of ridiculous for me to try and think I need to know all of those things. Really, it's exactly as you said. I think for people coming up, knowing that these skills that are required, no matter what the game is, no matter what the job is, people skills, self-awareness, personal understanding of what it is that allows you to perform to the best of your abilities, whether that's in game, whether that's supporting outside of the game, is so much more important than focusing too much in any one area. I'll always come back to the better off, the more well-rounded a human being you are, the better a high performer you're going to be. And again, you could be a high performance teacher, a high performance coach, a high performance athlete, a high performance firefighter. Like, if you want to do the best at whatever it is you choose to do, you need to really understand yourself. And I think that, just as you alluded to, there's so many things beyond just grinding a game. Understanding, why do I react this way? Why do I get pulled into the toxicity when I'm waiting to queue up? Why do these things that maybe don't really align with my personal core values, why do I let them sort of draw me in? And I think once we can understand, or even just be aware that maybe that's what's happening, that's when we start to have a much better opportunity understanding of, well, how can I actually achieve whatever it is I want to achieve without getting sucked into, this negative spiral that so many of us within esports get drawn into.
So it sounds like when the enemy team tells me to touch grass, they're not flaming me, they're actually giving me really good advice.
There you go. Exactly. It's all about reframing that.
Exactly. Got to find the nice placement of the lens there. So I'm looking at a little bit of a long question here, but it sounds like an interesting one. So stick with me.
Mhm.
Prem asks, in terms
Mhm.
of performance, do you see any differences between that of collegiate esports and esports at the highest level, specifically with challenges and methods of teaching or consulting from your work with the Lambton Lions and the numerous esports organizations you have and are working with?
Great question. And I'm going to say, maybe this is the opposite of what some people might be expecting. Is I'm going to say, I think a lot of times at the collegiate level, I'm going to say even like, the academy level, a lot of those athletes, a lot of those coaches are doing way more to up level themselves than those at the professional highest level. Like I sort of alluded to before, I think oftentimes those at the highest level just got there based on pure talent alone. And oftentimes what gets us there is not what's going to keep us there. Whereas those people in the collegiate scene, those who are looking to try and maybe get to that top level eventually, they are just at a very different different approach to how they are going to get better. And I think they're the ones who are understanding, you know what? Maybe I don't have quite the reaction time that the top players do, but what can I be doing that they're not that is going to allow me to compete at that level? And, in traditional sports, we often see it's those guys and girls who are on the bench, who aren't the starters, who are the ones who actually test a lot better on a lot of the performance metrics. And it's oftentimes because they're the ones who are putting in that extra work. And, when it comes to a point where everything else is equal, we have those people who have equal, genetic gifts. But then you have that person who maybe started doing some of these other things a little bit more. Well, they're not just going to catch up, they're going to leapfrog them. And so I think when it comes down to, one of the earlier questions of how are we going to get to what is it going to look like in a few years time when it comes to mental training from esports, you're going to have this next generation who are going to be just as gifted, but they are going to be so much more up leveled when it comes to all of these other aspects, that those people who have been very successful for years and years and years are going to be like, oh, wait a second, I better start doing something more if I still want to be in this scene, a year or two from now. So really interesting question. I would say that, a lot of those collegiate esport athletes, they're just doing things, I would say, a lot better and a lot more thoughtful than some of those at the top level.
Okay. And then a quick flip flop to something more casual. Kilkona asks, who's your favorite coworker at Atomos?
Well, I'm going to say the one that signs my paycheck. So I'm going to have to throw this out to Caleb Cousins, our CEO. No, I'm just kidding. It's, one thing I will say, and I this is my coworker, Jared. The team at Atomos, I will say this. I've been part of different teams, both from as an employer as well as, as a strength and conditioning coach. I've worked with dozens of elite teams in all sorts of different sports, all sorts of different types of businesses. And I'm just, I'm so grateful and thankful for the team that I've got at Atomos. Just some really, really great people. And what gives me the confidence to know that they are going to help every single one of our clients is that, like, these are people who actually just, I think, have the same values that I do, is they want to help. They just want to help people. And if that means helping them is going to help them, achieve a championship, great. But more so, they want to just make sure that these are happier, healthier human beings first. And so, I love all of my coworkers at Atomos. I am so grateful for them every day. And knowing that I get a question like that is just makes me smile. So thanks, Jared.
Very well politically answered. Good. Well done, Matt. I had a very interesting question as well, because your transition to esports has definitely brought about plenty of experiences. Who has been your favorite player to work with, if that's something you want to disclose? And do you have a favorite memory while working in esports?
Oh, I'm going to stay away from the favorite player because they're all my favorite players. No, I think I will say this. I've been very pleasantly surprised with following esports for years. There's some of those personalities where you sort of see what they're like on camera. But again, talking about those identities, when they take off their gamer identity, like, they are some good people. So I've been really pleasantly surprised by how many people I've had an opportunity to work with and support who I kind of expected to have big egos or just be completely closed off to having a growth mindset. And really, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with 99% of the athletes I've had the opportunity to work with. So, sorry, what was the second part of the question there?
I mean, that pretty much answers it.
Okay.
The second part of the question would be like your favorite specific memory of.
Favorite specific memory. Okay, yeah. This one I will say is, and again, it comes to that human connection thing. So kind of touching off of that, there is this big name athlete who, he was an up and comer, was just, I ended up going to a championships tournament. It was actually my first opportunity to actually go to a big event in person, and part of that was just see all of the behind the scenes interviews and stuff, and then just having the opportunity after the event to sit down with him, and we ended up just going out for a burger and just sitting there for an hour and a half and just hearing his story and his reason behind what he wanted to do. was just really, yeah, it was really nice to connect with him on a personal level.
Okay. Well, it's good to see. It looks like we are being pushed to answer one final question here, Matt.
Okay.
So what I want to ask you, and something that I think would be a strong takeaway for anyone watching, is what makes you a coachable person, whether this be as an athlete, as an esports player, or just in approaching life in general. What would make you a coachable person?
Self-awareness. We need to just understand ourselves, understand what our motivations are, our ambitions are, understand why we react to situations the way we do, understand what it is that is impacting our behaviors. Where I always start with people is just we need to start on for most of us, including myself, our awareness, and it's a constant work. And so I think that those coachable athletes are the ones who really understand themselves, and those are the ones who have, I've used it before, that growth mindset. They're willing to really say, hey, listen, I may know a lot of things, but there's always more things I could be learning. And so that to me is really, really the key, is just knowing yourself is really going to, allow you to be coached and allow you to be your best.
Okay. Well, you guys heard it here first. Self-awareness, keep yourself in your own mind and make sure that you keep an eye on yourself and know when to be able to ask for help. And basically a routine checkup on yourself is essentially what I'm hearing, Mr. Matt.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, without further ado, we're going to start closing out the show. Thank you guys, everyone in the audience, for tuning in for this TSM University Q&A. Next week, we have another Q&A on Wednesday, May 18th, 5 p.m. Pacific. And remember to join the Discord to ask your questions once again at discord.gg/TSMU. And of course, thank you, Matt Fisher, tonight for answering all of our questions.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone, for watching, and we'll see you next week.